Welcome back to Red Horizons, science fiction through a leftist lens. I'm your host, Steve McPhail, and this is Episode 4, Red Shadows, Blind Spots on the Martian Frontier. Over the first 3 episodes, we walked alongside Kim Stanley Robinson's Mars trilogy. From the first breath on red soil to the uprisings that shook the domes, and into the stubborn work of rebuilding something new. Robinson's vision is ambitious, a society trying to live without capitalism, reinventing itself ecologically, technologically, and politically. Published in the 1990s, the trilogy is widely considered one of the great epics of hard science fiction. Robinson mixes political theory, planetary science, and human drama into a decades-long chronicle of colonizing and terraforming Mars. It's won Hugo, Nebula, Locus Awards, and it's been praised as both rigorously researched and politically daring. For many readers, it's the closest science fiction has come to imagining a fully worked-out post-capitalist society. But the one thing leftist politics teaches us, critique doesn't stop when you love something. It becomes more urgent. Praise without critique isn't solidarity, it's complacency. A socialist loves a flawed revolution enough to name its flaws, because unexamined myths harden into the foundations of new oppression. No utopia emerges on blank ground. Its soil is seeded with the history, ideology, and power structures of the world that made it. Even the boldest futures are often built with yesterday's bricks. Think of Star Trek's Federation, still running on colonial expansion and military hierarchy beneath its utopian rhetoric. Or E.N.M. Banks's Culture, where a benevolent AI-led society still wrestles with the paternalism of civilizing less advanced cultures. As Marx put it, history is the tradition of all dead generations, weighing like a nightmare on the living. A nightmare that doesn't just vanish because you move to another planet. The Mars trilogy isn't just a set of novels. It's a laboratory for the politics of the possible. It asks, what would it take to break from capitalism's death spiral? How would we organize the first post-capitalist society? But it also inherits our world's silent biases, a vanguard mostly from the white, credentialed elite, gender politics shaped more by second-wave inclusion than intersectional liberation, near total erasure of disabled and neurodivergent lives, and a deep faith in technocracy, where expertise substitutes for collective power. These aren't small oversights, they're ideological boundaries. And as anarchist, Marxist, and anti-colonial thinkers remind us, boundaries are political. They decide who belongs, who decides, and who gets quietly erased from the revolutionary horizon. Here's how we'll navigate this episode. First, we'll interrogate the whiteness of Mars's political core and the colonial gaze embedded in the rhetoric of terraforming and settlement. Then we'll turn to patriarchy under new banners, how gender and kinship politics remain more earthbound than Mars-bound. From there, we'll explore the absence of bodies deemed non-optimal by capitalist productivity logic, and what a disability-inclusive Mars could look like. Finally, we'll challenge the technocratic belief that planning by the educated few can replace the messy, unpredictable power of the many. Because utopia isn't the end of conflict. It's where the fight to make the unseen visible truly begins. color of the red planet, race, colonial gaze, and the whiteness of the Martian vanguard. From its first pages, Red Mars frames itself as a planetary leap for all humanity. The Ares mission is marketed as a mosaic of Earth's diversity. Japanese agroecologists, Egyptian media brokers, Russian engineers, American geologists, Indian physicists. The launch carries a UN flag, as if this voyage could somehow embody the whole species at once. It's a compelling image, one that borrows from real-world iconography like Apollo's lunar missions, the cooperative spirit of the International Space Station, and even the early rhetoric of the Antarctic Treaty. Humans as explorers, working beyond politics. But that promise of plurality contracts almost immediately. By the time the trilogy settles into its rhythm, the characters who shape Mars's destiny, the emotional core, the political heavyweights, the moral architects, are overwhelmingly white, Western, and steeped in the cultural and educational capital of the imperial core. Frank Chalmers and John Boone, both Americans. Sax Russell, the archetype of the enlightened rationalist. Anne Claiborne, grounded in geological empiricism straight out of the Royal Society's charter. Arkady Bogdanov and Maya Toitovna, Russians whose worldviews still orbit the same technocratic gravity. Robinson never hides the tensions between these figures. They disagree about terraforming, revolution, governance, but those disagreements happen inside a shared framework. Cedric Robinson called it the epistemology of racial capitalism, an inherited worldview that shapes not just answers, but the questions you're able to ask. They're arguing over methods, not challenging the foundation itself. And when the global South appears, uprisings in India, climate collapse in Africa, mass protests in Latin America, it's rarely firsthand. These events are filtered through Martian council meetings or political gossip, like distant weather reports. The effect is subtle but telling. The planetary periphery is background noise, not a co-author of history. This isn't simply a failure of diverse casting. It's about whose perspectives define the boundaries of the possible. Mars is imagined as an empty frontier awaiting transformation, an erasure that mirrors the logic of real-world settler colonialism. The myth of terra nullius, or empty land, justified indigenous dispossession in North America and Australia. Here, the empty planet masks the continuity between colonial conquest and planetary settlement. The land is raw material for the vanguard, not a partner with agency, memory, or meaning. The language itself, terraforming, colonization, making Mars safe for humans, carries centuries of baggage. Fanon warned that liberation without decolonizing the mind simply redrapes the master's house in new flags. In Robinson's Mars, the revolution is led not by those most brutalized by empire, but by those already fluent in its administrative tongue. Characters who could disrupt this arc: Hiroko with her Ariophany, a spiritual political ecology that treats Mars as a co-equal partner, or Art with his media network amplifying marginal voices, are strategically sidelined. Hiroko becomes a legend in the background, rather than a policymaker in the room. Art's network never shapes constitutional debates. Again and again, the narrative re-centers the white professional class as the primary agents of change. History offers ample analogs. Antarctic expeditions in the early 20th century were hailed as global scientific efforts, but in practice were dominated by European and North American powers carving up zones of influence. NASA's early astronaut corps was almost entirely white and male. even though Black and Indigenous pilots, engineers, and scientists were present, simply excluded from the astronaut pipeline. In the present day, the rhetoric around Mars from agencies and billionaire space programs still leans heavily on images of elite, technologically trained crews, while the people most at risk from Earth's crises are left out of the story. But this exclusion is not inevitable. Nnedi Okorafor's Benti trilogy centers a Himba protagonist whose scientific brilliance is inseparable from her cultural identity. Becky Chambers' A Psalm for the Wild Built offers a post-capitalist society where tea monks and rural stewards are as politically relevant as engineers. These narratives prove that leadership doesn't have to default to Imperial Core's archetypes. So what if Mars's first 100 were drawn instead from the world's margins? Imagine climate refugees from Bangladesh, whose survival strategies include intricate flood-adapted architecture and community-led disaster response, designing Mars's first aquifers. Picture Sami reindeer herders adapting their centuries-old ecological knowledge to the planet's migration patterns of ice and dust storms. Picture Palestinian farmers with generations of experience resisting land theft and water scarcity, developing agriculture that treats every drop as sacred. Push further. What if the foundational science of Mars was shaped by Mapuche cosmology, where land is a relative, or Yoruba ecological ethics, where stewardship is part of spiritual governance? In such a Mars, architecture might grow organically with the terrain rather than impose on it. Agricultural domes might be organized as commons rather than corporate or technocratic projects. Dispute resolution might happen in circles under the stars, not in glass-walled boardrooms. Without these possibilities, the utopian horizon narrows. The revolution becomes as a benevolent export from the core, a redrawn map whose center hasn't moved. And that matters, because a utopia built without those most harmed by the old world is not a utopia at all. It's a gated community in space, pretending to be the future. The question is not only who gets to go, but whose vision are we building? Until the answer comes from the margins, Mars will be red in color, but pale at its core. Gender in the Void, Feminism, Patriarchy, and the Reproductive Imagination. When you build a society from scratch, you're not just deciding where the cities go or how the water flows. You're deciding what kinds of lives are possible, drawing the boundaries of the normal, the desirable, the thinkable. On Mars, Robinson's settlers reinvent much: agriculture, governance, the architecture of cities under alien skies. But when it comes to gender, kinship, and sexuality, the reinvention is partial. The surface shifts, but the deeper gravity is still Earth's old patriarchy. On paper, the Mars trilogy offers openings. Women hold political power. Hiroko's underground commune, Zygote, raises children collectively, loosening the grip of the nuclear family. Anne Claiborne becomes the intellectual anchor for the Red Movement, her revision shaping planetary politics. Maya Totovna navigates coups, constitutional congresses, and revolutions. These women aren't decorative. They're central to the plot. Yet the underlying pattern is familiar. Women lead only if they perform in masculinized terms: rational control, political stoicism, decisiveness under pressure. In Red Mars, Maya is lauded for her charm and political acumen until her mental health falters. Suddenly, her competence is doubted, her decisions reframed as irrational. Anne's geological purism earns respect, but only because it mirrors the detached empiricism already valorized in male scientists like Sax Russell. The double bind is alive and well. Be competent without seeming cold. Be emotional without seeming irrational. And fail at either without losing legitimacy. Hiroko's vision is more radical, a planetary politics grounded in ecological reciprocity. In Zygote, parenthood is collective, kinship is fluid, and children are raised as much by Mars as by human caretakers. Care work here is central, not peripheral. Reproduction is a shared act, not a privatized duty. Silvia Federici argues that capitalism's first accumulation was the privatization of reproductive labor, and that post-capitalist futures must reclaim it as a commons. Zygote points directly toward that possibility. And yet, Hiroko is pushed to the margins. We hear more about her than from her. Her politics are treated as mystical, almost pre-political, the Mars mother archetype instead of a revolutionary strategist. The Ariophany becomes a shrine to visit in moments of crisis, not the foundation of governance. This is a classic liberal containment strategy. Honor radical care rhetorically, while keeping it outside the halls of power. Then there's the silence. Across 3 long novels, we have no queer families of political importance, no central same-sex partnerships, no trans or non-binary characters, no gender transition, despite a society capable of altering genomes, extending lifespans, and adapting bodies to alien climates. In a world where human physiology is redesigned to survive thin air and low gravity, gender remains stubbornly binary, fixed, and culturally static. This is the paradox of much late 20th century feminist science fiction. Vast technological transformation without comparable transformation in gender systems. It's second-wave feminism projected into space, focused on inclusion into existing power structures, not dismantling them. Intersectional feminism, as articulated by scholars like Kimberly Crenshaw, would ask how race, class, sexuality, and disability intersect with gender under Martian conditions. But Robinson's Mars keeps gender as a single axis, women versus men, with equality defined as parity at the top. The contrast is stark if we look at other works. In Rivers Solomon's An Unkindness of Ghost, queerness and non-binary identities are woven into daily life aboard a generational ship, shaping labor, kinship, and resistance. Anne Leckie's Imperial Ratch trilogy collapses binary gender in language entirely, forcing readers to confront how much social meaning is packed into pronouns. Samuel R. Delaney's Triton treats gender as a mutable choice, subject to the same social negotiations as a career or religion. Against these, Mars feels politically bold but socially conservative. And that conservatism matters. As Audre Lorde and Angela Davis remind us, liberation isn't just adding women to the ruling class. It's restructuring the systems that produce ruling classes at all. On Mars, political legitimacy still flows from traits coded masculine by Earth's patriarchy: control, detachment, decisiveness, while emotional intelligence, collaborative care, and interdependence remain relegated to the domestic or spiritual margins. So what if those other values were centered? What if Hiroko's Ariophany wasn't fringe, but the colony's core political framework? Imagine a constitutional Congress where Zygote's principles are debated alongside terraforming policy, a room where childcare cooperatives have as much sway as climate engineers. Imagine a Mars where leadership is measured not by efficiency alone, but by the ability to maintain life, ecologically, socially, emotionally, where queer kinship networks are foundational to survival, and gender transition as routine as oxygen recycling. There are real-world precedents for this kind of thinking. The Israeli kibbutzim experimented with collective child-rearing. Black feminist organizers in the U.S. built mutual care networks under conditions of extreme political and economic hostility. Indigenous nations have maintained kinship systems that center extended family and community responsibility. Each of these could be a blueprint for an alternative Martian social order. Patriarchy doesn't vanish with a new constitution. It adapts, in whose leadership is doubted, whose voices are sidelined, whose futures remain unthinkable. If you can terraform a planet, but you can't reimagine gender, how revolutionary is your revolution? The radical potential of Mars lies not in its domes or oxygenators, but in designing a society where care work is visible, kinship isn't dictated by biology, and every body in every configuration belongs. Until then, the revolution remains incomplete. Disability, neurodivergence, and the myth of the optimal colonist. Mars is not a forgiving place. Survival depends on the most delicate choreography: pressure domes holding against micrometeorites, crops coaxed from alien soil, radiation blocked by walls thinner than your arm. One missed alarm, one faulty seal, one bad judgment, and you're done. In the Mars trilogy, that danger shapes who gets to go. The first 100 are chosen for peak physical health, high cognitive scores, and what's called emotional stability. In Red Mars, we're told the selection process eliminates anyone with significant chronic health needs, psychiatric conditions, or impairments requiring daily assistance. It's the same right stuff mythology that defined the Apollo astronauts. The future belongs to the fittest. But fittest is not neutral. It's a value judgment, rooted in centuries of ableist thinking. The belief that some bodies and minds are inherently more valuable. Historically, that belief dovetailed neatly with capitalism's need for productive workers and colonial hierarchies of human worth. In this logic, the disabled aren't excluded by accident, they're excluded by design. The trilogy inherits this wholesale. Across 3 long novels, no central characters use wheelchairs, navigate sensory impairment, or rely on long-term care. Adaptive technology, the kind that could make Mars livable for far more people, barely exists in the narrative. Life-extending treatments and genetic engineering are used not to diversify human ability, but to normalize it toward an optimal standard. Neurodivergence gets similar treatment. Maya's volatility is framed as a flaw to be managed rather than a symptom of relentless pressure and trauma in a hostile political environment. Arcady's uncompromising idealism is depicted as charming but naive, a quirk to be overcome. Sax's intense focus and social detachment, traits that today might be understood as autistic, are deficits until he acquires emotional normality through injury and recovery. In this framework, difference is something to be fixed, not accommodated. This is not just representational erasure, it's ideological. It says the revolution's future will be built by a filtered elite, not by humanity in all its variety. And that's absurd when you consider what survival on Mars actually demands. Disabled people already navigate hostile environments every day. Social, physical, and political. They're experts in adaptation, improvisation, and interdependence. Disability studies scholar Alison Kafer writes that accessible futures aren't just about ramps and braille. They're about making interdependence the baseline. On Mars, that could mean designing habitats from the start with multiple sensory interfaces, visual, auditory, tactile, so everyone can monitor life support systems. It could mean robotics and drones extending mobility across rugged terrain for those who can't walk long distances. It could mean communication systems designed for multiple languages, cognitive processing speeds, and neurotypes. Imagine a blind ecologist mapping Mars's biosphere through shifts in air currents, the taste of mineral dust, the feel of vibrations in the regolith. Imagine a deaf engineering crew developing signed communication perfectly adapted to pressure suits, freeing them from radio static and language barriers. Imagine a wheelchair-using architect designing domes with wide, modular corridors so every habitat is as navigable during an evacuation as in daily life. These aren't sentimental inclusions, they're survival strategies. We can even see precedents in speculative fiction. In Becky Chambers' The Long Way to a Small Angry Planet, disabled and neurodivergent crew members are integrated into starship life without fanfare. Their differences are treated as strengths. In Star Wars' extended universe, the Miraluka, a blind species, navigate space entirely through force sensitivity, reframing perception as power. These examples show how disability can be central to world building rather than absent from it. By excluding disability and neurodivergence, the trilogy reproduces capitalism's survival filter. Only those already deemed productive deserve the tools to live. It imagines liberation as the triumph of strength, not as the collective management of vulnerability. But vulnerability is universal. Everybody will need care at some point. The political question is whether society treats that care as shameful or as the starting point for solidarity. A truly revolutionary Mars would treat accessibility as infrastructure, not charity. It would assume every body is valid, every mind brings knowledge worth integrating, and that technology exists to widen the circle of belonging. Against the grain, work, class, and the limits of technocratic imagination. For all its revolutions and constitutional debates, the Mars trilogy is, at heart, the story of planners, scientists, engineers, agriculturalists, administrators, people whose legitimacy comes from technical skill, the ability to model climates, simulate political outcomes, optimize resource flows. They're not aristocrats or corporate magnates. They're credentialed professionals, the rational elite. It's an appealing fantasy. There's a certain left-liberal seduction in imagining a world run by people who actually understand how its systems work. Give the climate scientists the power, the thinking goes, and maybe we'll stop the planet from burning. But as Marxists, anarchists, and anti-colonial organizers have long warned, technocracy doesn't cure hierarchy. It just reshuffles the ruling class. The core logic stays. Some are born or trained to rule, others to be ruled. On Mars, that logic is unbroken. The first 100 hold political authority not because the population chose them, but because they were chosen before a population even existed. In Green Mars, after decades of survival, their continued presence at the top is treated as self-justifying proof of competence. Survival of the fittest becomes a kind of political credential. Technical expertise stands in for democratic mandate. The working class is present, miners tunneling under the crust, farmers coaxing crops from regolith, maintenance crews keeping oxygen flowing. But their political agency is mostly off-stage. In Blue Mars, there are passing mentions of strikes in the outlying settlements, but they fade quickly, narrated through the eyes of planners who treat them as disruptions to be managed rather than political movements in their own right. History has shown where this mindset leads. In the Soviet Union, engineers and bureaucrats replaced aristocrats but preserved top-down control. In Chile's Project Cybersyn, socialist economic planning was filtered through computer models without deep grassroots participation, producing elegant dashboards but little worker empowerment. Even Cuba, for all its gains in health and education, wrestles with the tension between centralized expertise and mass democracy. In the United States, the Tennessee Valley Authority electrified vast rural regions, but was designed and run largely by engineers and administrators, with minimal say from the communities it transformed. In China, projects like the Three Gorges Dam showcase the scale technocracy can achieve, and the scale of displacement and ecological harm when local voices are ignored. The alternative is messier, but proven. Direct, participatory control by the working class. The anarchists of the Spanish Civil War collectivized farms and factories under worker committees, making decisions in assemblies that anyone could attend. The Zapatistas in Chiapas reject both state control and corporate development, grounding decisions in village councils and rotating leadership. In Rojava, multi-ethnic feminist bottom-up governance has taken root in the middle of a war zone, with technical experts advising but not overruling community decisions. So what would Mars look like if it were built this way? Picture terraforming as a federated project negotiated between miners, biologists, farmers, and care workers, not dictated from orbit or from a central dome. Imagine a constitutional assembly held in a greenhouse with sanitation workers, nurses, and technicians seated alongside political theorists and atmospheric engineers. See a sanitation workers' strike halting a high-level political summit until demands for hazard pay, reduced exposure to toxic dust, and equal representation in safety committees are met, the resulting agreement reshaping how every dome is built and maintained. In this Mars, engineers still design oxygenators, but their deployment is decided collectively, with frontline maintenance crews empowered to veto unsafe or untested designs. Biologists still study soil regeneration, but planting schedules are decided by farmers, whose experience with crop failures carries more weight than any simulation. And care workers, the ones who keep the colony's human systems alive, set the standards for housing, work hours, and public health. The trilogy flirts with this vision. Arcadi's political philosophy gestures toward worker self-management, but even he frames it as a designed system rather than an ongoing, contentious process of struggle. It's revolution as blueprint rather than revolution as practice. But revolutions are made in practice. They happen in the push and pull between expertise and lived experience, in the refusal of the exploited to be managed, even by those with the best intentions. A truly revolutionary Mars wouldn't just redistribute resources, it would redistribute the right to decide. It would put the working class at the center, not in the background. Until then, Mars may change its flag and redraw its maps, but the center of power will stay the same, in the hands of those who plan, not those who work. Utopia's blind spots. We've spent this episode walking through the cracks in Mars's utopian mirror. Not to tear it down, but to see it clearly. Because if a story matters, if it's powerful enough to inspire us, it deserves to be questioned just as much as it's praised. Praise without critique is flattery, and flattery changes nothing. Robinson's Mars trilogy gives us a revolution as grand as the horizon itself. It shows us courage, ingenuity, the will to reimagine a planet. But when we slow down and look at who carries that revolution, a pattern emerges. Its vanguard is overwhelmingly white, Western, and professional. Its political debates play out in the language of the imperial core. Its most radical possibilities, collective parenthood, ecological spirituality, interdependence as survival, are pushed to the margins, embodied by characters who are mythologized rather than empowered. We've seen how race remains the silent center of the Martian revolution, how patriarchy adapts itself even under alien skies, how disability and neurodivergence are erased before the story even begins. We've seen technocracy framed as liberation and the working class treated as a force to be managed rather than the heart of the struggle. The trilogy is bold in scale, but in many ways conservative in its imagination of who gets to belong in the future. This isn't unique to Robinson. It's the gravity of our own world pulling on our dreams. We imagine the new through the lens of the old. We carry forward unexamined hierarchies because they feel like common sense. And yet, that's the very work of critique, to name the common sense for what it is, a choice, not a law of nature. If Mars teaches us anything, it's that revolutions are never finished. They're ongoing, fragile, and incomplete. A constitution can declare equality, but unless it's built into the oxygen systems, the food supply, the schools, the media networks, the family structures, it will stay a declaration. True liberation is not a single leap into the future. It's a daily practice of widening the circle of who belongs. That's why stories like the Mars trilogy are worth wrestling with. They hold up a vision we can admire while also revealing the limits we have yet to push past. They invite us to imagine not just a red planet free from Earth's control, but a society free from the hierarchies that have kept most of humanity outside the halls of decision. If utopia is to mean anything, it must belong to everyone, not just those who were chosen first. And the work of getting there doesn't start on Mars. It starts here, in how we choose to dream. That's where we leave Mars for now. Its struggles, its victories, and the lesson that liberation is more than building new systems. It's about dismantling the old logics that cling to power even when the banners change. Without that reckoning, the future shrinks to fit the shape of the past, no matter how far we've traveled from Earth. In our next episode, we step onto Larry Niven's Ringworld, a breathtaking megastructure with infinite space, yet an imagination hemmed in by eugenics, hierarchy, and market logic. We'll peel back its engineering marvels to see how the genre's grandest dreams can still be built on the narrowest visions of who belongs in the future. And we'll ask why so much hard science fiction insists on carrying the soft, unexamined politics of exclusion into the stars. I'll see you next time. This has been Red Horizons. Red Horizons is written, produced, and hosted by Steve McPhail. Original music by Parker Kent. Find us on Facebook, Instagram, and Blue Sky at Red Horizons Pod. Support the show and hear episodes a day early at patreon.com/Red Horizons Pod. Always free, always ad-free.